So very excited. So do you come to see you got the chair? Yeah. Where are you based in? Where I go? Hey, no worries.
Like you said, I mean, you're welcome.
E na mana, e na rio, e rua rangatama ma. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody, welcome. My name is Michael Kingsley. I'm the acting Dean. I'm not a very good singer and dancer, but I'm the Dean of Science at this current time at the University of Auckland. It's my honour and great pleasure to welcome you to the University and the 9th edition of the Ihaka Lecture Series. In 2017, the Department of Statistics launched the annual lecture series, which intends to share and celebrate research in statistical computing and its applications to science and society. As you may already know, the Ihaka series is named in honour of Associate Professor Ross Ihaka, who is with us today, whose contributions to the field of statistics cannot be overstated. Back in 1993, Ross, along with Robert Gentleman, created R, a statistical programming language right here at the University of Auckland. R quickly became very popular among a growing community of statisticians and programmers, not least due to it being freely available. Its open source nature, cross-platform compatibility, and ability for anyone to create and share new features meant it steadily grew a community who collectively developed an environment where modern statistics were available and accessible to a wide range of research worldwide. R didn't just democratise data analysis, it empowered interested in statistics to develop the skills and confidence needed to create their own tools. R remains one of the most popular programming languages in the world today, and it's a great source of pride for us to say it was created here. The 2025 Ihaka lectures are about geographical data and how we can make sense of it, especially with advances in modern computing that have made maps more accessible as a form of data analysis. Over the course of 2 lectures, Professor Dan Exeter and Professor Adrian Baddeley will show us how they make use of the wide range of tools that are now available to interpret complex geospatial data, enabling us to extract information that is richer and more layered than ever before. Before we move on, I have an announcement. The announcement is not a pretty one, so I apologise for that. But what I am asking you is when you leave today, I've been asked to inform you to take all your food and any evidence of drink with you when you leave. Now I've done that bit. I thank you all for being here, and I hope you find these lectures incredibly enjoyable and enriching. May I invite the chair to introduce today's speaker, Dan Exeter. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Ihaka Lecture in 2025. And I'm Yanan from the Department of Statistics. And tonight, it is with great pleasure to introduce Professor Dan Exeter, who is a well-known world expert in public health, geography, and data visualization. Dan is academic director of the School of Population Health in the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences. So he is the president of New Zealand chapter of Australasian Epidemiological Association, the fellow of the New Zealand Geographical Society, Royal Scottish Geographical Society, and Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geographers. Dan's research typically involves the use of geographical information science, big data, and the secondary analysis of large administrative datasets within Statistical New Zealand's Integrated Data Infrastructure (IDI) to investigate the causes and consequences of health inequities. In 2018, Dan and his research team developed the New Zealand Index of Multiple Deprivation and received the New Zealand Spatial Excellence Award for People and Communities. So in tonight's presentation, Dan will show how to use a geospatial lens to identify and investigate differences in health and social outcomes, with examples at the nexus of geography, statistics, and public health. Please welcome Dan.
Kia ora, Yanan. Tēnā koutou. Engna mana, engna reo, reo rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Haere mai ki ngā rangatira, haere mai ki ngā manuhiri, haere mai ki ngā kāmahi, haere mai ki ngā tauira. No Portugal me te United Kingdom, oku tūpuna, I whānau mai ahau, I Tamaki Makaurau, ko Ahurangi Pip Fora, ko Ahurangi Robin Flowerdew, rātou, ko Ahurangi Paul Boyle, oku kai tiro tiro. He Ahurangi mata whenua haura, hoki ki te haura taupori, e mahi ana, ko Daniel Exeter ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody. For those who are unfamiliar, I just said my name is Dan Exeter. I have ancestry from Portugal and the United Kingdom. I welcomed you all, whether you are from town all gown and recognised that my supervisors academically were Pip Fora from my master's here at the University of Auckland, and my two supervisors for my PhD at St Andrews were Professor Paul Boyle and Robin Flowerdew. It is an absolute privilege to be with you tonight, and following on from the introduction from Michael in the presence of being here in the presence with Ross is just outstanding. So thank you for coming tonight, Ross. I think it's amazing that Ross with Robert Gentleman had that vision and collaboration to give rise to the programming language that's not just a language of code, but it's a community that we can all share and understand and build on. And the geospatial tools that I use today are part of a kaupapa that is really built on a simple idea, which is data should be available, they should be a public good, and they should be provided with insights that should be shared as widely as possible. So I hope to do some of that this evening. For those of you who don't know me, before I do that, I think Ross's legacy not only lives on in code, but in the communities, as I said, but it also, this series acknowledges his massive contribution. And I say massive contribution because in a statistical audience, I'm not allowed to say significant without making any qualification on quantity. So I'm a health geographer. I am a spatial epidemiologist. I am a cartographer. I'm a big data person, however you want to say that. But I use big data and GIS to tell narratives about health inequities and trying to improve population health. So with today's lecture, all going well. We forgot to do that bit. Today my lecture is coming on board, hopefully. Come on, wakey, wakey. Come on. We've had this problem before. Oh, I can see my presentation. It's amazing. Well, while we're doing the IT situation, it's not seeming to, it seemed to have not wanted. Hey, we've got one. Is that going to work? Dun, dun. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. The title of my talk today is Vis-ease and using visualization to move beyond the conventional. When I was a master's student, I went to San Diego and did a presentation as a poster called Vis-ease, and it was really about bringing out the way in which we can communicate visually patterns in space through visualizing epidemiological data. And really, it's a mantra that I've lived by ever since. When we're doing communication visually, we want to try and make our graphics as easy for others to understand while making it as easy as on ourselves to reproduce those if we need to. So before I begin, I thought I'd just start off with a very quick definition of population health and a couple of other housekeeping matters. If you spoke to any of my colleagues in the School of Population Health, there's many of us, will each give you a different definition of what population health is. It depends on our background and our discipline of interest. Many of my colleagues are cancer or nutrition or cardiovascular disease researchers. My disease of interest is deprivation. And we'll be talking a little bit about that. That's not to be mistaken, like my mother-in-law once was when she said at church she was talking to her friends to say, my son-in-law's coming to pick me up. He does research at the university. He does research on depravity. So close. She knew that it was something to do with poverty or deprivation, but there we are. So to give you an illustration about what population health is, I'm going to use my left hand here and to go through each of the 5 fingers to represent different scenarios of our population. So we've got our pinky, perhaps the weakest, the most vulnerable member of society, need a little bit of encouragement sometimes to do their bit. The next finger, What do we know that one is? It's our ring finger, symbol of wealth and potential earning and opportunities. The middle finger is the tallest, it's the most loud, if you like, it's the audible, it's the most readily visible. The index is kind of the doer. It's good at pointing and telling you what to do, but it's also good at doing stuff. It's like good at grabbing and working. And of course the thumb is pivotal. It can sort of be supportive, and it's one of the strongest ones. It's a little bit short, but it works and does its job. Now, each one of these 5 fingers has its own function, and it works and it stretches, and sometimes it's a little bit arthritic, but apart from that, it's not until the whole becomes a hand to do stuff together that we can see the benefit of the whole population working together. So sometimes the little finger might be a little bit broken or dislocated and we need to nurture it a little bit. As a whole, the hand becomes the whole of the population, and it's not just the benefit of those individual fingers, it's the strength that we see together as that whole. Population health is built up around concepts and frameworks, whereas public health is about using those frameworks and moves away from the what kind of questions to the how questions, and is focused on interventions and uses the concepts that population health provide to identify actions and systems that need to be improved among different populations. And if we have a how question and we have a what question, we surely have to have a where question. Where do we prioritize? Which populations? Where are the groups that we need to identify most? So health geography fits into this section with identifying places of risks to prioritize need and to inform equitable outcomes. I said in my abstract that people often contact me for heat maps. Dan, can you do a heat map? And this is very much I think I might have had a conversation similar to this just in the room just outside. Kia ora, Dan. We need a heat map of whatever the topic is for our whatever we need, and it's due tomorrow. Can you help? Ngā mihi, whoever. Oh, sorry, we've got no money, which is kind of part of the funding environment. Of course, we'll say, yeah, of course we'll do that. When they're asking for that particular task, they're looking for something like this, a map of Auckland or some dots on a map or something like that. What I think when I'm talking about a heat map is something like this, which is a matrix with numbers and kind of graded cells according to whether it's hot or cold or meeting a target or not. So this is how I see a heat map when they first say it. But typically what they get when I do the geocoding and do the analysis, all of the work that we present would typically come in the form of tables at the top, and an Excel spreadsheet is the easiest way to provide something for people to go into R and other places to do their analyses. We could give them some bar plots or some other kind of graphs that they need, and of course we'll provide some maps either in static form like this, or as you'll see we do a lot of Shiny apps interactively as well. It would be remiss of me in a health geography context to not do a lecture and present John Snow and the story of John Snow and the Broad Street pump for an example of that inextricable link between population health and public health and geography. So this was in the 1800s, about 1850. In Soho in London, there was a cholera outbreak. The main thinking at the time was that cholera was spread by bad air, basically sneezing and miasma. And John Snow was a physician, and he recorded the location of where his patients were getting infected and where they lived. And so you can sort of see Broad Street is right in the centre of the map. The black marks that represent little dashes are where the people in the household lived who had cholera. And you can kind of see that there's a real cluster around the little pump on Broad Street, which was when we used to go and collect water from a pump, and we'd pump our water and take it home and drink. Interestingly, removing the handle from the pump also meant that the incidence of cholera reduced, and so became the realization that cholera was indeed a waterborne illness, not a miasma disease. This map's really cool because not only does it tell you where people were, but it also tells you where disease was not. And so if you're looking along Broad Street, you can see, obviously, there's a good cluster of people, of houses, lots of black dots, and then there's like a couple of spaces where there's nothing. And it's like, oh, what's happening there? Do they not go to the doctor? Maybe. But you can see a little bit further up the road, there's a brewery, and a little bit further along, there's another brewery. Some of the people who worked in the local breweries would take the water from the local brewery home. So even though they lived on Broad Street, their water source was different to the mainstream tap that we would typically get from the Broad Street pump. So there was kind of like an exposure and a non-exposure within the same sort of environment. So it's a really helpful way of thinking about population health and mapping and seeing how we can learn so much more from the data. My first foray into health geographics and health geography was in 1997 and 98 when in Auckland here we had a measles epidemic, and my colleagues at Auckland Public Health came to my supervisor in geography and said, look, we know epidemics. This is how we do epidemic curves. We know that there was a peak. We know what the distribution was. But to be fair, mapping's not in our wheelhouse, and it's deliberately a bad graphic, but this was their published graphic of the measles incidence in the 1997 epidemic, and could we do anything to help them better understand the motion and the moving around of the spread of measles. So my master's research started by looking at how infectious diseases spread. And typically at that time, the most common way of spreading or modelling the spread of disease at that time was on a grid-based system. So we'd group a population area such as Auckland here into maybe a 1 kilometre grid as we've done here, and we'd use assumptions to see how long it would take to go from the red dot, which is kind of the Grafton campus, down to the yellow dot, which is roughly Penrose Station on the train line. Probably a 25-minute train journey nowadays, I think. But if we were thinking about how we would do that with the typical modelling approach and the probability of the disease spreading, you can kind of see how many times it would take, how many iterations it would take for that disease to be spreading from sort of the CBD down to Penrose, where we were expecting the next case to appear. So a flip side of moving away from doing grid-based analysis was to use the road network. And so road networks are made up of nodes and of segments of the road that can be configured in a way that, as we know, we have different speed limits on motorways as we do on arterial roads or in little cul-de-sacs with judder bars. So with the road network model, we started off with these nodes representing individuals, and we sort of apportioned the population. We assumed that a person could walk around and do daily activities, and that's kind of depicted here with that orange sort of segment representation. And the speed of which people walked around, represented in the yellow, was also depicted by the impedance, how fast do people move around. That was, instead of using road traffic information like velocity for the cars, we'd use socioeconomic status, and do we think disease is going to spread through particular places, or do you think it's just going to drive past and ignore particular places? So once you've had a contact space, we then identified a number of cases probabilistically within that, and so the spread continued and we could create epidemic data sets. The second part of the model was to map data, and this is a very crude map that we did. These are maps done in ArcGIS by command line, which is hideous. Even more hideous than some might expect. And we did a survey asking people I think we had about 200 people doing a web survey and asking them what they thought about the different types of maps that we presented. In this case, we're showing increasing symbols on the left-hand side and shaded symbols on the other, and asked people to say what they thought was better at communicating, in this case, the onset of disease over time. And so once we got all that together, we presented a matrix like this, which is basically a framework for epidemiologists to tell how to use disease data. Now, unfortunately for me, I loved Pip. Pip was an amazing supervisor, but the one thing Pip wasn't was an encouraging supervisor to make me publish. And so personally, this is the best piece of research that I've never published, because I think this has got some potential and it could have gone a long way. So if you are a student or you're a supervisor of some students, I can't stress enough to encourage students to get their work published. It is really important for you as well as for the wider community. So after I finished my master's, here's Pip looking through a camera lens and deliberately looking at us, but I don't know what Pip's seeing in there, because whatever Pip saw, we didn't necessarily see. He had a unique way of seeing the world, and in a really infectious way to think about all things geography. This was the first study that I did with him as a contract, and I was presenting these maps to my client, and this is NZ depth, which came out in this is the 1996 version, 9 census variables, all grouped up together, shows a map. In this case, pink is decile 9, red is decile 10, and I was presenting these maps. Thinking 21, this was kind of a big crew if I was 21, and I'd be like, should be pointing, what's this? What's driving deprivation here? And I'm like, well, ma'am, if you just look at the legend, the red legend down here says that it's the most deprived decile. That's the 10% of the whole areas of the country. That's one of the most deprived places in the whole of New Zealand. What about over here? She pointed to another part on the map in Northland. Well, if you look at the legend, by the third time she said that, I was kind of like, ready to be scalped, I think. So, but it did get us thinking, and we said, well, how do we visualize landscapes of deprivation? And so NZ depth, as we know it, even today, consists of 9 variables grouped together using this statistical process called principal components analysis. It ranks deprivation according to mesh blocks or small areas from the least deprived on the left to the right as the most deprived, and we typically use deciles. Groups of 10 or groups of 5 for quintiles showing different levels of deprivation. Now, typically, researchers just use the NZ depth off the shelf. But what happens if we use the principal components score and some of the cartographic license that's available within different GIS software packages to regroup how we bin those 10 buckets? What if we change the split and how we do those buckets? So again, hideous maps, think very, very late 1990s, not very good graphics. So here we had at the top left, we've got equal area, we've got quantile, we've got natural breaks and equal interval. Essentially, this is 4 different ways of grouping the same data set into 10 buckets using different definitions. And so if you're wanting to go and talk to a community group and say, our community is really, really, really deprived and we need some money and this is what we think this resource allocation is, we could choose one of these 4 maps and we might be sort of responding in a different way. Just by changing the way we configure the maps, we'll tell a different story. So this is kind of the first part of the landscapes. What's really deprived and what's not deprived, and looking at that tail that we thought of. And then I thought, well, conventionally, thematic maps, which we always use, the conventional map of New Zealand, this is a typical map of the South Island. On the left-hand side, these areas that are pink and red, again, those are the areas of deprivation we're most interested in. And for us, we wanted to say, well, actually, there's very few people living on the West Coast. We can tell that by the size of the zones. The boundaries that are created for rural areas, by definition, have to be big so that they can accommodate the population sizes that would meet the standards for the statistical measures that we're interested in mapping. So on the right-hand side, we use the population cartogram, and this is a contiguous cartogram, and this one was developed by Igor Drehi, who was a researcher here at the university and sadly passed away a few years ago. Again, all of the data on this side of the map and the conventional map is shown here, but the weight on this map on the right-hand side demonstrates significant areas more clearly, parts of Canterbury, Christchurch, Dunedin, Invercargill, Nelson, Blenheim, those townships or cities in the South Island have been exploded based on their population size to give weight to be able to navigate. Now, these are all static maps here, but they were indeed interactive and being able to use. So that kind of just gave us a way of looking at the landscape and telling the narrative a little bit further. But then we moved into using Chernoff faces. And Herman Chernoff, I don't know what he did in the 70s, I don't need to know, but he created a method of using a face to measure 15 different levels of geological samples. Now, we didn't have 15 samples for population health and the NZ depth, so we used the faces and the different variables from the census data to allow us to show us two areas, both blue, side by side, both adjacent, but the shape and size of the smile and the length of the nose and the size of the face, they indicate that things are different. So it's kind of telling us a narrative to think beyond that first level and the layer and peel back, kind of like peeling back an onion, what's really going on in that stratigraphy. This is a quick workflow map. This was before R. I was using S+ and still getting confused with S+, as I sometimes do with R. I don't know whether R was just because it's like, how do I do this next bit? That's generally how I'm using R lately. So we printed it in S+ into PostScript, and it was like 4 pages of little icons like this. I don't know if he's in the room tonight, but I walked across the campus from building 201 to here and met Paul Denny, who was in computer science as a senior tutor, and he coded in Java the code that I needed to do to take it from S+ into Java to apply some geographic locators, to then export it into a shapefile, which was the GIS language, and then to be able to make that map. So, you know, how things have changed, and we talk about that a little bit later. After I did all of that, I came away and went to Scotland and did my PhD, but epidemiologists, they always think about age and sex or deprivation and ethnicity when they standardize their populations. But oftentimes they never think about geography. Why don't we think about how boundaries change to be able to tell a story and look at changes? So often if we're wanting to look at data, this is a hypothetical. If we take data from 1981 and 1991, the boundaries always change. Census boundaries, well, if we have a census, the census boundaries will change because of the size of the populations. And so in 1981 and 1991, we can kind of see that if we overlay them, we have to do some sort of population estimation, and typically we'd say, oh, that area 1 is like 90% A and 10% B, and we'll end up with some random sort of proportion. So instead of doing that, we decided to use a merging technique, which came up with about 10,000 areas in Scotland that ensured that every household in Scotland was in the same zone for 20 years, not necessarily the people living in those households, that's a whole nother story. But it allowed us to look at changes over time in a different way. So typically, we look at health inequalities. Quintile 1, the less deprived on the left-hand side. All of my stuff will be left-hand side, least deprived, right-hand side, most deprived. And we have dark grey represents the first time period, and the second, the grey, the more recent time period. And we would see that premature mortality reduced pretty consistently across the board. But using the cats, as we called them, we could identify in a matrix whether places were always least deprived, they were always well off, whether they had improved over time relatively, whether they were always persistently deprived, or whether indeed their neighbourhoods had worsened. And we could use the census deprivation index that we were using to be able to look at the places that were always least deprived, the quintile 1s. They had much better reduction in mortality than places that improved. The static places, the same, still same. Most deprived, persistently most deprived. So this is kind of like the Glasgow, the eastern ends of Glasgow that you might have been familiar with. if they were persistently deprived places, those neighbourhoods had an increase in mortality by 10% compared to what we saw in the previous map. So what we do with our geography and how we analyse things makes a difference. And so it's kind of looking at a different way of thinking. The CATs also allowed us to look at different things like clusters of suicide. And suicide clusters typically were referred to cases where people were known to other people and died typically by the same means. And so a very small number of cases, and the research at the time, the evidence was saying rural, the Highlands and Islands of Scotland were the places where the suicide strategies needed to be implemented to prevent suicide. And so with the spatial data sets, instead of looking at the data on an individual case by case, we looked at a whole of population approach, a very population health approach, and we used a statistical scan statistic, the spatial scan statistic, and identified clusters of suicide in the east of Glasgow in the 3 time periods that we were looking, and we could see that it was persistent, and it was, again, these are the worst parts of, well, these are the most deprived parts of Scotland. In fact, at the time they were deemed the most deprived parts of Europe. And so the severe deprivation was where we were identifying the clusters. When we did this analysis again, controlling for deprivation, those clusters disappeared, just identifying that deprivation was a key predictor of those clusters in that space. When I came back to New Zealand, we were doing some work with cardiovascular disease, and one of the jobs we were doing was doing a template for the Health Quality and Safety Commission. And so the HQSC had a template. This is an interactive map using a product, I think, called Instant Atlas. It was great. It was interactive, it was available online, it had a great summary or commentary of what the data was and what it meant. But from a stats or a graphics perspective, we've got a table telling you the same information which is represented in the graph, which is also represented on the map. And if you changed one of the legend items from, we're showing Māori rates here, if we change to one of the age groups or even within the ethnicity group, the map would change, but the scale would change. So all of this information would change. And so you might think that you're comparing apples with apples, but it was really hard to do. So we thought it'd be really helpful to HQSA to change the legend and look at it a little bit more clearly, making that Vis-ease come through, easy visualization. Using a legend that's consistent across all of the different classifications and definitions. Making the map the most important thing on the screen, because we were showing a map, and probably because I was a geographer and liked maps more than I liked words, but hey. The table and the commentary became buttons that could be displayed on top of this ring map if you wanted to look at the plot. And this one was, again, using brushing and linking, we could just identify different places on the map. We could still see what the trend was and how it compared to the national average. And if we wanted to get a sense of how we did overall for different things, we could look at the radar plot and see whether we were doing better or worse. Anything above the red was doing better than average. Anything below the red area was worse than the average. But I was talking beforehand, everything that I did, I'd be talking to one of my colleagues, I don't know if Grant's in the room, and I'd say, Grant, I'm just doing this, and this is how I'm doing it. And he'd say, there's an R package for that. Didn't matter what it was, he'd be like, there's an R package for that. So we ended up doing the R packages and moving into R more and more. And so it also shows that just because we've got access to spatial data doesn't mean the best form of communication is spatial. And so this is a simple plot using ggplot and facets to say what is the population distribution by 5 different ethnic groups and different age bands for the 4 cardiac regions in New Zealand. So there's a lot of information to digest, but it's pre-attentive. You can get a sense that big circles have a higher quantity than smaller circles. And we can sort of see with the legend that the ages are there and how they differ. So it gives us an idea of that quick, easy communication. I guess this is probably the closest to the depravity part of the research that I've ever done. And I was talking to a colleague who was explaining to me that they'd been doing a walk through the Waitakere Ranges, and just off to the side of the footpath was a whole lot of byproduct from the production of meth. And so there was a meth lab somewhere, and they'd just dumped it in the forest and gone. And he said, this is really, really bad. So we were starting to look at what is the geography of methamphetamine production? Where are the clan labs? So we started that conversation, but we ended up getting a master's student to look at this. And so the conventional map of what the clan labs would look like, the distribution, the lighter green showing not many clan labs, darker green showing more clan labs, according to the police statistics. But again, we used the scan statistic. Instead of looking at independent statistics, we looked at the whole data set and the geographic space to say, do we see any clusters? What are the main trends? Whereabouts are they? And so the clan labs, we got police data. It was very specific data. We're not allowed to demonstrate, we're not allowed to plot that individual level data, but we had the location of that of the clan lab seizure by the police. We had some demographic data about the person that was on site, I guess. And there was also the type of lab, whether it was, some people were walking with a backpack on that had their clan lab, like they were walking along to school or wherever with their meth lab in their backpack, which is a bit scary. But anyway, back to this. The clusters, the SAT scan analysis allowed to identify clusters over and above what we would expect from the population. We found, again, West Auckland in the previous map showed the higher levels. That was kind of confirmed here with a couple of clusters. Northland, again, was identified as a cluster. But when we ran that, these are crude or unadjusted analyses, when we adjusted for median income or gender or age or whatever, a range of demographic factors, when we adjusted for deprivation, we could see that some of those clusters were explained by the high levels of deprivation in those particular places. So thus explaining that top cluster on the right-hand side. But while I was doing all of this, I had this sort of scratch in the back of my head. What about deprivation? What is driving deprivation? And so even though this is now the 2023 NZ Dep map, I'm still asking myself, or was asking myself, why are all these red areas red in 2023 when they were red in 1991 or 1996, but also is the deprivation experience in one of these red areas that are quintile, these are quintile 5s, decile 9 and 10, are these areas experiencing the same type of deprivation as other parts of New Zealand that are equally deprived? And so I got some funding to do the index of multiple deprivation using not so much census data, but using admin data to do our analyses. We followed a rubric or the international standard in the IMD, but we're using all New Zealand specific content and New Zealand indicators specific to New Zealand. So each one of these banners, employment, income, crime, housing, health, education, access, those are domains which there's about 28 or 29 different indicators within each of those domains. We can map each one of these layers of deprivation to allow us to explain or look at the drivers of deprivation. But we can also see the overall pattern. And when I showed this graphic to my wife and said, look, this is my research. This is like my HRC $1 million graphic on a page. She went, oh, is that all It's like, yeah, it's a good summary, but hey. So we started looking at, and so we went back to that question, what are the drivers? And so again, using brushing and linking, we're comparing two adjacent areas, highlighted blue and orange here, out West Auckland. We can see, again, this is another product that we were using. This is still another instant atlas map. So, of course, it's going to be rising because it's a rank, so it's not an equal distribution, but anyway. The blue and the orange are both quintile 5 areas, but this little worm, if you like, shows that while they're very, very similar in terms of overall deprivation, and they're almost identical in terms of employment levels of deprivation, they do converge when we're talking about crime or health or education or indeed access. So what we wanted to be able to do is to try and tell that narrative a little bit more. And so that started another conversation with the Centre for E-Research, and I'm not sure if any of them are here tonight, but Mark and his team, I've worked with Nick for a long time, they're very much, yeah, that's a great idea. Do you mean this? Or, I've already done that, we'll do this kind of thing. So working with Mark's team is phenomenal. He introduced me to using Shiny, and so we do most of our maps as a base map here, all the cartography. It allows us to link to Google to do a Google geocoding for an individual address or as a batch. But this particular example is in response to some community advocates who wanted to advocate against liquor licenses or licenses being issued in their community. And so the map essentially, this loop shows us entering an address, using some of the spatial functions to run in the background and do a little bit of geocoding, and then some mapping where you saw the 1 kilometre or 2 kilometre buffer. This is the 2 kilometre buffer. And then we got all of the information and behind that around sensitive sites and existing outlets. And with an email address, you get an email within about 2 minutes with the report of your profile. So under the hood, it's a little bit more. We use a range of different services, but it's broken down into doing some mapping using the spatial functions, obviously using Markdown, and then we're using the mail-r function to allow us to produce a report so that this is written in a language for lay users so that they can then go ahead and attach this to their sort of objection to the district licensing committees and so forth if they wanted to. My colleague Jessie Colbert is a research assistant, and she's been sort of taking forward some of the landscapes context again, looking at the 8 domains, the overall IMD and the 7 domains, to look at ways in which we can think about landscapes of deprivation and showing those different stories that overall deprivation might be one pattern, but it's really not just the whole thing. Don't just look at the index and say, oh, deprivation's bad here. It's kind of the same as it is over here. Peel it back a little bit and use different techniques and query and look at, I know that these are all district health board level, but we could do these for census areas or smaller areas, but you'd be able to see how the overall pattern of deprivation looks, and very quickly you can kind of see on the rows plot, the higher the value, the more, like the bigger the segment, so forth. These are spark lines. These are showing the overall pattern between NZ Dep in orange and black is the IMD. So for each of the DHBs, you can kind of see where there's some similarity or there's some difference between the ways in which we've measured deprivation. We continued to use R and ggplot2 in the various functions, probably not as quite an elegant as what we see tonight on the backs of t-shirts, but we were using the Dawling plot here as well, and we're using DH bins at the far side to look at how do we tell that story, just exploring the ease with which we can get the communication across. In 2018, I decided to go back and look at turn-off faces just to see if we could do it. We can. This is the Manurewa General Electorate. I use electoral boundaries quite a lot because we elect people to represent us in our neighbourhood, and we could hold them to account for things that are going on in our society. So I'm using the GED a lot. The electoral boundaries tell a narrative for our elected members. So this is showing the IMD plot, obviously in the background, but again, the faces are slightly more evil than they were when we did them in the first version of S+, but nevertheless, they still told the differing narrative. But we also made it interactive. Within Shiny, we can make this all. Is it going to play for us? Again, we can zoom in. This will take us into the Bay of Plenty. We were just tinkering again, looking at the difference, but we can also add the mouse over. It's showing us the overall ranks and the DHB and so forth, but there's a whole lot of other spatial information that we could add in behind here, or we could add other layers of information that I'm not showing tonight that we could just look at associations much more easily. And again, we're using a range of the tools that are available. Jessie was great. She said, I like the turn-off faces, but can we try something else? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And so she found a way to do petals. And so here we've got each petal we've got in the center, we've got the overall deprivation as the circle, and then the length of the petal represents the level of deprivation, and the lower the deprivation, the longer the petal. You're thinking more deprived, even if we think about water as a deprivation measure, if we're water deprived, we start to sag and get a bit tired. So we can see that in the color coding, but we can also see that some areas are particularly lacking, and because we've got the legend down here, we can see that it's crime and housing that these places are lacking in terms of their levels of deprivation, even though the light background in the back and the circle represents the overall pattern of deprivation that is relatively less deprived. So it's really about trying to communicate with ease the pattern, and it's about pre-attentive patterns. If we can give you a legend that obviously is going to take a bit more than a few seconds when you're doing it in a lecture space like this, but if you can digest the legend and start thinking, then it gives you time to understand what we're showing and how we're showing and what those patterns mean. One of the really cool things I've liked about working with all of the students that I've been working with, and this is an honours student from Stats, Minling wanted to do a Shiny app. That was her goal for her honours dissertation, and so I thought about a topic. And out West Auckland, we still have licensing trusts. Licensing trusts are basically you pay a little bit more for your alcohol. You can't buy your alcohol at a supermarket in the same way that you can, say, in Mount Eden or down in Queen Street. But you pay a little bit more, and that trust money goes back to the community in sports goods, and we've received smoke alarms and all sorts of things over the years. So what we wanted to think was, are the trust areas providing, what's the association between access to alcohol by deprivation in the trusts area, and does it differ to the rest of Auckland? And so we kind of created a molar tooth almost of the CBD and excluded that if we wanted to do for our analysis. And then we said, what would happen if we changed some of the policies around alcohol availability to say, if we could put a minimum threshold between access to alcohol for sensitive sites like marae or secondary schools, or even if we wanted to regulate the sales of alcohol by minimizing the distance between stores. And so this particular app allows you to enter a distance from 0 to whatever you want, and it is the minimum distance between a school, a marae, and distances between the liquor outlets. And so in the background, when you click go on this, it does a number of GIS operations. Basically, it's buffering. It's just drawing a circle around each one of the schools or the marae based on that number that you've specified. And then we've also said for the outlets, we've done the same thing, drawn a big circle around it. And if we've got those constraints, we say, find everything that's not in those areas, so outside of the buffers, remaining. So this is what the before map looked like, and I don't know how well it shows up. You can kind of see that it's the red dots, the changes. There's some that stay the same, but there's quite a big pattern sort of around the Eden Terrace, between Eden Terrace and probably St. Luke's, I'm guessing, going through there. And then all down South Auckland, there's quite a shortage, if you like. There's quite a removal of outlets. And so looking at that, just to say, well, what does that mean for alcohol-related harm? And unfortunately for the dissertation, she didn't get to that point about what does that mean for the hospitalizations, and that's the next part of the analysis. And this would be, now we've done this, what is the so what? And the great thing about the app and the availability is that somebody's always interested in doing some analysis. They're always keen to take on topics, and they can, because it's reproducible, this is up in a GitHub repo, we can add to it and continue to tell that narrative and work on it. Now this is for alcohol, but what if we were interested in gambling pokie machines? Or what about vape stores? Vape stores are far more prevalent in terms of their availability, but also they turn over really, really fast. So you need a good data set to think about how we can get a good data set to be able to tell this narrative and keep up to date. So while this is an alcohol example, it could be for any of the social harms that we're interested in. And it's using GIS in the background without telling people that they're using GIS. Just like what Google does when you say, oh, I'm going to dinner at this place, how do I get there? All that route finding stuff that's going on in the background is the spatial analysis that many of us take for granted, and others are like, oh, that's cool. Being a stats assignment, there was also an obligatory bar charts and things that Minling had to do. So this is a before and after scenario, deprivation quintiles. This is for the IMD. But obviously we excluded the CBD from the analysis, so that doesn't make any difference. But you can kind of look at the distribution and the number of outlets based on those conditions. In the other areas, the non-trust areas, you can see that density is dropped down quite considerably, and there are other elements that you could look at through the map as well. Minling used a range of, all of the different techniques here, basic T-map for basic thematic mapping, and then we went into leaflet and kept on going from there. Nothing was too difficult for Minling. I was fascinated by how quickly she could turn around some of these things, because for me it was basically, right, I've got this piece of paper and I want this map here and do this, and what about this here? And it's like, here's my scrap piece of paper, and then this is what it became. So well, it's just so masterful that I'm in awe of how these are being produced. Jamie White is a researcher up in the UK, and he was looking at the IMD in the UK, and he did this thing called the lava lamp plot, and he used violin plots by parliamentary constituency, essentially our general electoral districts. And he created these lava lamps. If you think of using one of the standard GG plots and the color scheme, this would be much more of a lava lamp feel. And he basically, so we replicated it because of the joys of R and GitHub repos with a little bit of consultation with Jamie. And basically each one of these are from the 2018 IMD and all of the electoral boundaries at the time. And so what each of these violin plots is basically, if we assumed it to be a box, the density or the number of zones in each electorate that was of a particular deprivation level would be based on its width. So if it's a nice wide, area, then it's going to show that there's a wide number. So it's a wide number of low deprivation areas. And then at the top, it's obviously a wide band of high deprivation areas in those electorates. And then there's the shapes in between. So what does this tell us at site? Well, it's a little bit of fun because you can think up some new names for your electorate because of the shapes that it's created. But at the top in Manurewa, it shows that Manurewa is on average the most deprived area in terms of electorates in the whole country based on the IMD. But what it shows is that when we divided, remember that binning for the principal components? When we split the ranks into 20 groups, known as vigintiles, you can see that it goes from about probably down to 15 is probably about where it is. So from 20 down to 15, maybe 12. Down the bottom here, we can see that Selwyn is really, really wide at the bottom. It's got lots of areas that are not deprived, and it probably goes up to about, again, 12 or 13, and there's nobody in the most deprived areas. So looking at the lava lamp shows you the geography quite quickly in terms of the density by deprivation. And you could do it for quintiles and for deciles, but it's not as elegant in terms of the patterns that it creates. And of course, we don't have to think about spatial when we're doing our analyses. And so this is what we refer to as the graphic equalizer plot, but you might need to be an age to understand what a graphic equalizer is. So what this is the 20 DHBs in New Zealand, the IMD and the 7 domains are in consistent order. And basically we're showing what proportion of data zones of small areas are in each deprivation category for each of the different things. So what it allows us to do is, I can't jump up to the top screen, but if you're looking at Northland and you move along to counties Manukau, you can kind of see that those first set of bars is roughly saying that about 40% of Northland and about 40% of counties Manukau in that first block of bars is bright purple, so they're among the most deprived areas in New Zealand. So there's about 40% of data zones that are the most deprived. And then what we can see for the other 7 bars that are associated is that graphic equalizer shows that the experience of deprivation is quite different in Northland than it is to counties Manukau. And you can see that by the level of the blue or the purple that's moving up and down in those different ranks. I've shown you a handful of examples today, and I've only shown you a very quick way of how we've visualized deprivation in a number of ways. But all the work that I do covers a range of different things, whether it's vaccine hesitancy or early childhood. We've done economic evaluations, access, COVID, all of these different things. These are all the different topics that I've been doing with a spatial lens, working with a great number of colleagues, and it's without these colleagues that I've been so fortunate to work with people here in New Zealand, people in America, in the UK, all around the world, and many of the names in here are the key contributors to the R environment that I've been working in. So if your name's not up here, it's not that I've not deliberately excluded you, it's just that I've not yet published with you in that space. And so thank you to everyone. I think the main message is whatever you're doing, whatever your science, knowing your audience is arguably more important than knowing your data. If you're using some data and you're using graphics that people can't explain or can't navigate through easily, then we're missing something. So that's just my final word, and I didn't have a time in front of me, so hopefully I haven't gone too far over. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thanks, Dan, for the very, inspiring lecture, and especially show how, apply different R package and geospatial tools to present the data in different ways. So let's give another big round of applause for our fantastic speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Questions? Do we have time?
apparently we've got time for questions.
Yeah, okay. Let's let's allow for 5 minutes for questions.
All right. Stunned. Yeah, Elaine.
You showed a map of, I think it was P-lab clustering.
Yep.
That was, I guess, raw, and one that was adjusted for deprivation.
Yep.
That showed that Northland, well, once it was adjusted for deprivation, Northland did so.
Yeah.
So how do you explain that to people for whom you're producing the map?
So obviously that was a master's research topic, and the question was about the clan labs and the clusters. The crude cluster showed an evidence of a cluster up in Northland, and the second one showed no cluster up in Northland when we controlled for deprivation. And I guess the interpretation would be like any statistics really, where if we have an unadjusted model that shows a pattern, and when we control or adjust for different variables, and that relationship is explained by the presence of or the variability of that deprivation. So in the workflow for that particular one, we would have probably had something like geographic information, number of P-labs and the time period. It would have been a space-time cluster as well. And then we would have had additional information, and we would have added in deprivation to that and said, once we've accounted for the high levels of deprivation in that cluster, it would be, I guess, what you'd expect over and above the pattern of deprivation in that space. So it's explained by the presence of the high deprivation levels up there. Hope that helps. Yeah, sorry, Simon.
I have a question that's sort of related to the fact that, I've been working with some of the Auckland maps as well. And one thing that kind of struck me is one thing I always struggle with is Rangitoto. Because it kind of, it doesn't show up because you either have zeros but you actually did have an deprivation index for Rangitoto. So I was wondering what it's based on.
I think probably what we showed in the Rangitoto map.
Yeah, that one, yeah.
That's not my map. That's NZ depth, but hey. I think in our maps for the IMD, I don't know, typically for the IMD we wouldn't have the data. You can see that just up in the corner there. It could be about how the places are categorized. And so SA1s, the small areas that we use in New Zealand as our building blocks now, must meet a certain population threshold. And in order to do that, sorry, I'll just move that up because it's annoying me. If we want to do that, oftentimes there might be a residential location of I think there's like still huts in or rangers huts or whatever on Rangitoto, and so there might be that it's merged with maybe one of the other islands or the closest mainland to say that it's part of. We've tried really hard in terms of, with the 2018 index, we merged data, small areas together to have a minimum threshold so that we excluded all of the counts where there was no permanent residents like Rangitoto and Browns Island. So yeah, sometimes it's about balancing your cartography skills with the data that you have available, and working through some of that is quite a challenge as well. It's a new challenge for the 2023 index, which we're about to release soon too. So yeah, cool. All good, easy. Thank you.